Okay, so this video is called The Beginning of the Civil Rights. So we're going to backtrack and talk about kind of how we got here to begin with. 1865, the 13th Amendment was passed that banned slavery. 1866, Congress passed the Civil Rights Act, which made all citizens who were born in the United States citizens and gave them equal rights. The 14th Amendment made it illegal for states to infringe on the rights of citizens, including voting rights, so states could not pass laws to prevent citizens from having rights. In 1869, the 15th Amendment made it legal for states to pass laws to discriminate against voters. So you couldn't have, literacy test or writing test, or you had to own a certain amount of land. No laws like that could happen. So despite every step forward the government and Congress were making and the attempt of many individuals to step forward into civil rights, the Supreme Court and many other groups, not just Supreme Court, you had the KKK and stuff like that, the Supreme Court worked to prevent equal rights for African Americans by passing a bunch of laws in Supreme Court cases that kind of made these irrelevant for a very long time. So in 1896, the Supreme Court ruled in Plessy versus Ferguson, which is a Supreme Court case, that no civil rights were violated if places were separate but equal. So essentially there was a train, car that an African American person wanted to sit in, and they said, no, we can separate those as long as the two accommodations are equal. So separate but equal. Obviously we know that even though things were separate, they weren't equal, and separate and equal are definitely not fair to begin with. So it put us a few steps backwards. So how do we get to progression of equal rights? So the South began to pass Jim Crow laws, which is another way that groups of people began to segregate and discriminate against African Americans. These laws were created to segregate races down in the South. African Americans could not attend the same schools, they couldn't sit in the same sections in restaurants and movies, on buses, whatever the case was, they had to be segregated, they were in separate places. Plessy versus Ferguson court case, of course, made this possible because they ruled that separate but equal, so as long as you were equal, you could be separate. Obviously we know that's not true. Along with these discriminatory laws, racial violence against African Americans grew, the KKK, and then just outward violence in general and hatred towards African Americans. And now that African Americans had fought in World War II and they had fought against racism, Hitler's racism towards all the races over there, they were no longer willing to accept in the United States, so they began to stand up. And this kind of led to the birth of the modern civil rights movement in the 1950s and 60s, and so that's where we are with the beginning of this modern civil rights movement. So in the early 1950s, many African Americans were they were suing to integrate public schools. They wanted a fair education for all their children. And that makes sense. Everybody deserves a fair education. But school boards were mostly white controlled. So they were the ones making decisions, and obviously they were not going to allow integration. So these school boards were providing whites with better schools, newer banks, newer books, better equipment, and all in all, those schools were just better. And that's obviously not what the purpose of education is all about. Facilities were anything but separate but equal. Nothing of that was true. So Thurgood Marshall, I cannot talk today. Thurgood Marshall was the lead lawyer for the NAACP that challenged segregation in schools. So he met with the NAACP, remember that is an organization fighting for the civil rights of African Americans, and Thurgood Marshall is their lawyer. He does rules on a lot of he's a lawyer for a lot of prestigious cases and eventually sits on the Supreme Court as the first African American to be a justice. The Supreme Court accepted the case of Brown versus Board of Education of Topeka that Marshall was the lawyer for. So you have a Thurgood Marshall being the lawyer for this case, going to Supreme Court to hopefully integrate schools and no longer allow schools to be segregated. So the Supreme Court ruled on Marshall's side, saying the country's schools should be integrated. So all races should be able to go to school together, which basically overturned Plessy versus Ferguson of separate but equal. Now the issue there is that they didn't really put a timeline on that. So a lot of schools immediately desegregated and integrated to allow races to go to school together, but obviously others took their time, especially in the Deep South. And then in 1955, Rosa Parks was arrested for sitting in the front of a bus when all the African Americans were supposed to sit in the back. She was arrested in Montgomery, Alabama. The news of her arrest spread all over the world, especially got national attention, and it encouraged African Americans to basically ask all their fellow African Americans, these church groups, NAACP, they asked all the fellow African Americans in Montgomery, Alabama to protest this arrest and the trial of Rosa Parks by not riding the buses. So they were going to boycott the buses in Montgomery, Alabama. This protest became known as the Montgomery bus boycott. So that was a huge movement for civil rights and a very unified effort. So the Montgomery bus boycott, it lasted for about 13 months with leadership from many local leaders, including the very famous Martin Luther King Jr. Boycotters organized carpools, or they just walked to work or school, wherever they were going, to avoid having to get on the buses. Many white Americans obviously responded with threats and absolute violence, as they didn't accept the fact that this is what African Americans were doing. And then on November 13th, 1956, the Supreme Court ruled that the bus law was unconstitutional and you can no longer have African Americans in the back and whites in the front, that buses should be integrated just like schools were. This was a huge victory for civil rights, and African Americans began to board the buses again and ride them in Montgomery, Alabama. So the boycotts ended segregation on the buses in Montgomery, Alabama, so that was a huge benefit for them. It led to the founding of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, which is going to be an organization we'll talk about more, the SCLC, and they planned nonviolent protests and boycotts to help encourage civil rights and help give African Americans a voice in this process. And it helped Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. become one of the more prominent, famous, most notable, or one of the most notable civil rights leaders of the time.